let's move on to our next session, which is going to be on co-innovating with a corporate R&D lab, innovation for startups. And this talk is going to be given by John Calian. He's the Senior Vice President and Senior Vice President at Deutsche Telekom and head of their innovation labs in Berlin, known as T-Labs. Deutsche Telekom is one of the world's leading network operators. In addition to being the primary wireline and leading wireless operator in Germany, it holds stakes in service providers throughout Europe. And its wireless arm, T-Mobile, now also operates the third largest network in the United States after its acquisition of Sprint PCS. At T-Labs, John has led Deutsche Telekom's R&D push into smart city, Internet of Things, and 5G technologies and their enterprise applications. John has particular expertise in distributed ledger technologies, having co-founded the blockchain group within T-Labs and a blockchain startup, which he's spinning out of T-Labs. John has previously worked in the Seattle area for several mobility services companies, including Amdocs, Synchronos, and Copo, a fintech startup funded by Vinod Khosla. And as some folks may recall from Tehi's conversation yesterday, he talked about illustrating particular folks, and John Calian is someone with an instinct for finding and riding the crest of technology waves into the future, and he is well positioned to explain both sides of startup collaborations with larger corporations. So with that, John, good to see you again. Handing over to you.
Thank you for having me. So thank you for the introduction. It sounds, I think, better than reality, but I'll take it nonetheless. But it is true that I have seen all sides of this. I have a career that has been both struggling entrepreneur, working at some successful startups, a lot of large companies, and then most recently, the last 3 years at Deutsche Telekom, which is a massive company, over 200,000 people. And I was blessed with getting this role to run the research and development group, which gave me a tremendous amount of learning and really insight into how the big companies work and approach working with innovation topics, and of course, interacting with startups, which I made a priority. So I'm going to break this down. I'm going to run through a very short presentation that I give on innovation and what I've done to set up research and development with a fusion of entrepreneurship here at Deutsche Telekom. And as you mentioned, I'm actually in my last couple of weeks here at Deutsche Telekom. I'm launching a startup based here in Berlin, Germany, focused on blockchain, starting in July. So it's a really exciting time here. And after I give my short introduction to T-Labs, would love to open it up to any type of questions people have. I find that a little more fascinating. So let me share the presentation. So Deutsche Telekom, as I mentioned, over 200,000 people. We operate globally. We run 15 different wireless telco companies, and of course have a large presence here in Germany. I'm stationed in Berlin, which is the background you can see in the image here. And we are associated with the Technical University of Berlin. In Germany, T-Labs is known as an An-Institute. So we have a contractual partnership with this university and others. And really, academic research is at the core of this group. And for somebody coming out of the startup world, usually with not a lot of resources, it's been amazing to have at my fingertips professors, PhDs, and students to work with, people who are really into experimenting and pushing boundaries. So it's been a really fascinating and fruitful part of my journey here at Deutsche Telekom. So from the moment I began, I was handed a group, a 15-year-old group that had done very well on the academic side, but had always struggled to connect research and development back to the business side of the corporate company, Deutsche Telekom. So when I made my pitch for the job, I said, I want to do something fairly simple, which is let's introduce this idea of producing minimal viable products. And it was definitely shaking up the team here. And ultimately, most people enjoyed the kind of cultural shift that I brought as an American, but also as an entrepreneur, where we could not only think about producing academic papers, lecturing, and telling people what technology can do, but actually producing software. So I put a pretty simple phrase in for everybody. At this R&D lab now, we think disruptively, we make things, but then we have to connect back to the business. So this was really important, not only to make things simple, but it's that last word, connect, that I think transcends not just working at an R&D lab, but as being a startup as well. I like to tell everybody it's easy to think disruptively. Ideas are pretty cheap. It's much more difficult to make something. But the hardest part of our jobs, and I would say also as an entrepreneur, is making the connections, selling your story, selling your vision, making sure people understand what you're doing. And it really is not much different as an entrepreneur trying to sell to some large companies or direct to consumers as it is selling a disruptive idea back into a business unit of Deutsche Telekom. So we took this opportunity and we created a whole new approach to how we generated ideas, how we took them to the project point, how we raised money, etc. And we've had a fun time, but also some success along the way. So when you want to get into the business of producing minimum viable products, of course, you need a team. So as I've explained, we have a core of academia. We could reach out to the hundreds of people that we sponsor financially, and we can work with them to create ideas and work on projects. But one of the unique things I did, since I have a history of working with startups, was I just picked up the phone and started calling all the blockchain, artificial intelligence, immersive technology startups in Berlin, Germany, and even beyond, and started to figure out how we could connect directly and start working with them. So I would say that's one distinguishing thing I think we brought into this R&D group, was to be really open and bring startups into us rather than startups coming and asking to join us. And I found that to be extremely beneficial. So, if any of you have questions about what it's like as a startup to try to reach into a large corporation, we can definitely handle that in the Q&A part. And then lastly, as you're building a team, not only would you talk to academics or startups, but you can go into the company and talk to the different business units. As I mentioned, we operate all over the world, so you have the opportunity to join with a large variety of different people and stakeholders to help you on projects. All of this then enabled us to be, extremely open and think about an ecosystem approach. And here is where also with our cultural shift towards being more entrepreneurially focused and making things and connecting, was to be super inclusive. For those of you who have worked at really big companies, it's fairly easy to get siloed into a group and have a harder time interacting. So I pushed everybody to constantly be telling groups what you're doing and to be inclusive rather than exclusive. And I find this to be extremely beneficial, especially as I'm starting a company now. I stay pretty hardcore about being inclusive. The more you can explain about your story to everybody, the more the people talk about it, it has a really nice domino effect. I would say maybe the most important part here is, as you can hear from my voice and as I explained, I'm American, it's far easier for me to think about failing, or as I like to say, making mistakes. It is more difficult in Germany, and it is more difficult in a large corporation to be fearless. And so I've pushed, I don't know how successful, maybe with a few people, but I've pushed to introduce into the culture here at our R&D lab, a mistake culture is what I like to call it. How else can you learn if you're not willing to make mistakes? The important part of this, though, is when you make a mistake, to raise your hand and say, I've made a mistake, I was wrong about something, here's what I'm going to try next. It may sound obvious, but it's not always that way that I've seen in R&D groups, and it definitely wasn't necessarily that way in the R&D group I inherited. So we push this really hard, and the best way to do it is for me to lead by example. So almost every time I get up and speak in front of our team or other teams at Deutsche Telekom, I work hard to talk about the mistakes I make. So at least I can set an example there. Right, so team building, I talked about how we compose our teams, reaching out to different groups to work with us. But it really is, it's a simple thing, but you don't get anywhere unless you're a team. And so simple thing in our group, but we work hard to make sure that everybody feels like they're contributing and that it's worthwhile. And this is what I would say from a leadership point of view, I tend towards the attitude of I work for the team. So what does everybody need to be successful so that they can push innovation? And it should come from the leadership to support that. So that's where I believe team building starts. And I think this is the last slide. And this is important for everybody. And it's especially important if you're a startup and you have an investor or large corporate partners watching you. It might be that you have a great idea. It might be that everybody believes in your vision. Maybe you have experience, you've done it before, but really it all comes down to execution. Are you spending your money wisely? Are you ensuring that what you've built fits the market? And all these things lead to, are you executing correctly? And this is where the teamwork is really important. So that is how I've approached bringing myself and my ideas to corporate research and development. I think one of the nice outcomes is that I have in fact created with the team a technology that we are now spinning out to a startup starting next month. So it is possible to do so. It's not easy, but it's a different way to start a company. So at this point, the formal part is over, and I'm open to talking about whatever direction you all want to here on the call.
Thank you, John. We do
Sure.
have a question from Joy. Joy, would you like to ask your question directly to John?
Happy to. I think it's really important to have that culture that says it's okay to make mistakes, because if you don't, people aren't reaching far enough and iterating fast enough. We find when we hire people, though, they're generally coming from cultures that are not nearly so forgiving. The folks who venture far and make mistakes are the ones who get shot at in those cultures. So it takes a while to create change and make them accepting of our culture. What are your other tips beyond modeling from the top about how to do that?
Yeah, I think it's twofold, and I'll reiterate. If I'm not willing, and if the other managers or leaders in my groups aren't willing to talk about mistakes, how can you expect anybody else to? So Joy, if you're a leader, just set the trend. I mean, like when I have leadership meetings, you can even open it up and say, hey, I made this mistake last week. I even stand up and I say it slowly and intentionally about the mistake I made, let it sink in. But then I come in and say, this is what I learned from it. So that's one way to do it. You can also just force it in. Go around asking people the mistakes they've made, and then ask them how they want to approach talking about it. Some people are very private, or they're nervous about standing up in front of a group and talking about mistakes. I don't think there's any secret to it, Joy. I think you just force it from top down. And another thing is, if you see somebody do it, now that I'm thinking about it, this is probably really important. Make sure you're the best damn listener possible when somebody is talking about a mistake. Definitely, it's not a time to overtalk somebody or give your suggestion on how to correct it, but just be a patient listener and let people get it out.
Yeah, I think the other thing that we do is we have two rules about mistakes. One is, you have to share it far and fast because it can affect other people. So it's oftentimes talking through with them, okay, well, who else is going to be affected by this and how can we help them deal with it? And the other is you don't make the same mistake again. But
yeah, we have, I don't know if this is global or not. I only saw it here in Berlin, but we have fuck up nights. And I would say once or twice a month, somebody in Berlin is hosting a fuck up night. And I encourage my team, I've done it myself, and you stand up in front of 100 people and explain your fuck ups. That's an interesting approach too.
That is interesting.
Yeah. But I like what you're saying. It makes me think too, like, why not broadcast it out in an email or a newsletter, at least internally, to show the mistake, how it was rectified and what was learned, why not summarize that contextually as well, textually as well?
Thank you, Joy. Did you want to introduce yourself, Joy? It's a little after the fact, but at least you can introduce yourself and the company.
Oh, sure. So my company, Advanced Animal Diagnostics, does point of care testing. It's just for cattle. So we can have more animal protein that's produced more sustainably, reduced antibiotic use. That same technology we've actually pivoted into taking the animal test to a COVID-19 test.
Very cool.
Very good. Thank you. John, as you start your next adventure in the blockchain world and continue it further, we have a lot of startups who are in the enabling technology space and a few who are definitely in the security space. So what are your thoughts about blockchain presently? And do you think the technology is here and to stay and evolution? I know it's a broad question and we've been waiting for it, but please, love to hear your perspective.
Well, I believe in the technology so much that I'm betting my career on it. So that tells you one thing. And a lot of investors are supporting me as well. So that's good. Blockchain by itself, I mean, it's software and it's technology. There's no silver bullet in it. But what we've discovered is, and what I would say to anybody, it will be woven into all software system design within the next five years. Maybe a little longer, but something like that. And it's already starting to be. So we've come out of the phase where people assume you're just talking about cryptocurrencies as the application of it. And we're now starting to see examples of blockchain being used in all types of systems and domains. So clearly we're starting a company to, let me back up. I didn't explain. We have created a system so that any software development team can start instantly using different types of blockchains for any type of software. So we are infrastructure, enabling infrastructure, as you mentioned in the beginning. But I don't know if you want to ask more specific questions, but for us or for me, it's like you choose a database or you choose an operating system, you're going to be choosing different types of blockchain technology or decentralized technology when you start any project. We are on that path, and we're probably, like I said, about 5 years away from it being ubiquitous.
And
John, does that make sense?
It does, but there's a pathway there, and I think it'll become more widespread use over time. So that's what we look forward to. As you're starting your startup and growing it, we had some sessions yesterday where the leaders and the speakers spoke about pitfalls and what we need to be careful about. And especially in the COVID world or post-COVID world, that's on people's minds, including the startups. So what are some of the control points or things that you're keeping in mind as you take your startup to launch?
Sure. Well, starting with the two most important things for me, it's spending the money that we raise wisely, being extremely cost efficient. I don't think you can stress that enough. Watch every single penny you spend. Don't be frivolous with your money. I think there's different ways to talk and explain that, but you don't need a fancy office in the beginning. You don't need anything fancy, in fact. I think on a personal level, anybody I talk to who wants to start a company, I say, do you have a year or more of savings to live off of? Is your family ready for it? I mean, there's some basic things as individuals, but you can't expect to make any money in the first few years, 2, 3, 4, even 5 years. It's tough. So be really wise about spending your money and making a good plan and having a lot of backup plans. And then secondly, it's product market fit. How are you approaching figuring out if what you're building really matches what the market needs? And how flexible are you to adjust along the way? And I'm not being so drastic to talk about pivoting, which I think is can be a drastic step, but I mean staying flexible to the software or the hardware you're building. Those are the two main things. So And those can provide a lot of pitfalls if you're not thoughtful about what you're doing. But both of those things, I would say, I'm 20 plus years into a career. 20 years ago, I did not understand how much time I should have spent planning. So I have plans for everything. I have backup plans for everything. As I fall asleep at night, I'm making even more plans. So planning. You will appreciate all the effort put into it.
Very cool.
So in short, that's how you can avoid more pitfalls is planning, if I didn't make that clear enough.
Yeah, that's part of the secret sauce, but thank you for sharing.
It is.
It's obvious, but it's there, right?
Sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting. In the morning, we had CP Gurnani, who's the CEO and managing director of Tech Mahindra, and he gave, based on his insights and what he has seen across different startups and businesses that he has started or fostered through Tech Mahindra, he had the similar advice. He had like 6 Ps, where he was talking about pivoting, prioritization, proficiency. But I think what stood out for me the most was the stay the course. He used the example of finding Nemo and saying, keep swimming, and uptide, no tide, whatever it is, but keep going, because challenges will be there and you have to prevail. As part of this bootcamp series, one of the things that we want to help the startups with is a mentorship and how they can get better, because they have their pitches coming up next week for being in the selection process. So in your career, John, and as you were evaluating some of the regional semifinalists also for XTC, what do you look for in a pitch? Or when somebody is coming with their company? Tell us your thought process there.
I don't know if I have some formalized process, but I definitely try to understand, does the person or people pitching seem to have a good, confident grasp on how difficult it is what they're doing? And that's probably more art than science, and just listening for certain things. Just because I've been in the shoes, I've raised money multiple times, I've pitched countless times, I am trying to discern on their confidence level and the direction they're going. That's one thing. Secondly, I really like to understand, when do they see revenue taking off, and how realistic do they seem about the revenue? And I know firsthand, again, from raising money, how often I'm pretty much put on the spot about revenue, because that's ultimately what's going to drive the biggest part of the investing decision. So being really confident and really understanding the numbers you're putting in front of people and to speak through them is really important. So if I get some time with somebody, I'll try to quiz them through some of the basic things that you would be asked, right? And not just revenue, but your cost of goods sold, what's that margin going to be? How are you hiring people? What does that cost? So maybe some people don't take it seriously enough on the financial side, because again, a lot of people have ideas. It's wonderful to capture the vision. And so that would be the last part, is the vision. Do they have a big, beautiful vision? Because if they do, and they're a dreamer about it, I get really inspired myself, and I want to help people like that.
As they try to evolve and scale their business, what's a path beyond product that could be interesting for them?
Do you mean like what to focus on beyond product?
Mm-hmm. Like from a growth and revenue standpoint.
Yeah, no, I understand. Okay, so I think how I would answer it is, for every startup, from my point of view, first it's product, and then it's team. So for me, the stage after that, team, is really important. And team means setting the culture, because you tend to set the culture when you have 5 people, 10 people, 15 people, and it grows from there. So you have to pay a lot of attention to it. And I think everybody would tell you to be very careful with who you hire in the beginning, sure. And are they going to be adherents to the culture you want, or are they going to add to it in a positive way? So team building in the early stages is really critical. You can't afford to have even one person who's going to be a negative influence on the overall team, because they're not going to help you grow the culture. I think anybody here can read, theory about startup. Once you hit 10 people, things start to change. Once you hit 20, it changes. especially by the point you get to 50 people, you can't ever expect everybody to understand the culture that the first 10 did. So are you building a team that really espouses your culture? I would be that's a really big deal. You can't take your eye off of that. So that's the next stage. I think from there, then you go to scaling, not just the team, but the company. And then of course you have to get to profitability.
Mm. And that ties in nicely with what Peggy Johnson was talking to us about earlier when from Microsoft, she was talking about culture and how diversity and inclusion are important legs of the stool that they look at now across the board.
Yes.
From a transformational standpoint, as well as how it makes a difference and change. So
Yep.
I think that totally resonates in my mind. And my last question for you, John, is small startups, mid-sized startups, they want to grow their business. They want to approach a large corporation. How can they go about doing that?
Well, hopefully they have a friend who works at that large corporation and can have them navigate. It depends what you want to do. If you're in a product building stage and you need a big corporate to start validating your thesis and your vision of what you're doing, it's actually the stage we're in right now. We try to get 2, 3, 4 corporate innovation groups to work with us. So that's definitely something to shoot for. And you wouldn't expect a ton of revenue here. Think of it more as consulting. So that's one path that I've been on both sides of. I think it can be really beneficial as you're developing your product and getting ready to launch it to a bigger audience. If you have a product ready for sale, that's a different conversation. Because at a big company, it's not like you find one person who wants to buy your service or product. You need that person, your champion, but then you need somebody who actually signs the contract, the people in procurement, the people who deploy it. You're talking 5, 6, maybe 7 different groups. And then it can get complicated because you have to align everybody's incentive at that point to move forward. If it's not widely known amongst the audience here, it can take 6 months, 12 months, even 2 years to sell a product or service to a large company. So it's a real commitment, but nothing moves without networking and figuring out all the people who together make a decision. I hope that makes sense.
It does. It's the, where do you start and where can you go from there? So,
yeah.
And you brought up the point about connections. So, we're at the top of the hour for this session, but if anybody in the teams, the audience wants to reach you, what's a good way to get in touch with you, John?
Oh, find me on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only John Calian there. I'm quite active, so happy to. And like the last person, I can put my email address into the chat here.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, John.
Great.
And thank
you for having me.
Of course. And, being an ardent supporter of XTC from yourself personally, as well as Deutsche Telekom, we really appreciate it having you as the partner there. And I wish you all the best for your new adventure and look forward to great things. So with that, thank you.